Korea, summer 1950. The United States leads the United Nations into a war against communism in Asia. In winter, under attack from the Chinese communists, the UN troops are thrown into full-scale retreat.
It was a route exactly like the one that Napoleon faced leaving Russia. We ran headlong, helter-skelter, pell-mell, trying to get to Busan, trying to get back to Japan. It was disgusting.
The Cold War has become a hot war. August 1945. At the end of the Second World War, the Japanese army that had occupied Korea for 35 years surrenders.
말 가지고도 마음대로 하지 못하고 우리 법대로서
During the Japanese occupation, they forced us to follow the Japanese lifestyle, speak the Japanese language, use Japanese law. When we were liberated, we welcomed the soldiers.
사람들을 다 쫓아냈기 때문에 우리는 이분들을 환영해야 된다.
Russian and American troops liberated Korea, meeting together just as they had in Germany. As occupying powers, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to divide Korea along the 38th parallel as a temporary measure. South of the divide, the Americans were in control.
We made the Republic of Korea, really. Between the Pentagon and the State Department.
American generals installed a hardline anti-communist, Syngman Rhee.
His charm is somewhat deceptive because he's also very tough. He's absolutely unforgiving, very patriotic, and he's not nearly as sweet as he looks.
Rhee was appointed as first president of the new Republic of Korea in 1948. American troops withdrew. North of the 38th parallel, the Russians were in control. They established a communist regime through a network of people's committees. Kim Il-sung, who had spent the war in the Soviet Union, was groomed for power.
He was a very handsome young man, always smiling. Everybody liked him in Korea. He made a very good impression. He was the national hero of the Korean people.
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed, with Kim Il-sung as its president. As Soviet troops withdrew, Kim dreamed of uniting Korea under communism.
Kim Il-sung
understood that to resolve the problem of unifying the two Koreas was very difficult, that he would need help. Of course, the help he was hoping to get would come from the Soviet Union.
In March 1949, Kim Il-sung went to Moscow, his secret agenda to seek Stalin's permission to invade the South.
조선 정부 대표단이 모스크바에 지금 도착한 것은 조선민주주의 인민공화국과 소비에트 연맹과의 사이에 정치적, 경제적, 문화적.
Stalin, preoccupied with crisis in Berlin, rejected Kim's request to invade. By the end of 1949, the international situation had been transformed. The Soviets detonated their first atom bomb. And the communist revolution in China was finally successful. Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. A treaty of friendship between Mao and Stalin created a communist global alliance, opening a second front of the Cold War in Asia. Stalin was now confident that the United States lacked the will to respond to events in Asia. In April 1950, he finally gave approval for Kim Il-sung to invade South Korea. June 25, 1950. The North Korean army launches its surprise assault on the south.
I remember vividly even today, the day the war broke out. It was Sunday morning, and we heard this kind of remote, the roaring noise from the north.
Equipped with Russian tanks and artillery, and directed by Soviet advisors, 10 combat divisions of the North Korean army flooded south.
We believed that we had to fight for our motherland, for our people, for our leader, Kim Il-sung. We believed it would be better to liberate the South and to unify Korea. That's what we were fighting for.
Sunday morning in Korea, Saturday evening in Washington. The Sunday papers prepare to go to press.
It was Saturday evening. I got a telephone call from the UP duty officer saying that Korea had been invaded by North Koreans. And momentarily the remark stunned me so much, and I didn't know what to say. Whether he was joking with me or whether he was really sure.
Senior officials were recalled that night to the State Department.
When the invasion occurred of South Korea, I think there was an immediate sense that action had to be taken. Exactly what that action was to be and how far it was to go, it was not something we had planned on. We had not worked out of a contingency plan for a war started by North Korea with South Korea.
About midnight, there was a call from President Syngman Rhee. I took the receiver and I said, please ask American government to rush necessary help.
The South Korean ambassador went immediately to the State Department to see Assistant Secretary Dean Rusk.
He said, if I quote him, we felt that this is a matter America alone cannot be concerned with. It is a matter the world has to be concerned. And with that judgment, we have decided to summon the Security Council for an emergency session.
Noting with grave concern the armed invasion of the Republic of Korea by armed forces from North Korea.
The following day, the Security Council met. Moscow was boycotting the United Nations because of its refusal to admit Communist China.
Those in favor will please raise their hand.
The United States seized the opportunity to condemn North Korean aggression.
Carried by 9 votes for, 1 against, and 1 abstention.
2 days later, the Security Council voted to create a United Nations military force to defend South Korea.
This is, in fact, an attack on the United Nations itself.
Under the UN flag, soldiers from 16 nations would fight against communism.
We were elated. We felt very, very good, very encouraged. We felt, first of all, that probably Korean unification was to come about as a result of the resolution itself.
President Truman addressed the nation.
Korea is a small country, thousands of miles away. But what is happening there is important to every American. The fact that communist forces have invaded Korea is a warning that there may be similar acts of aggression in other parts of the world.
The feeling at that time was that a military operation of this magnitude could not possibly have been taken without the support of the Russian military. In other words, it was concluded right at the beginning that this was a movement, this was something happening in the context of the Cold War.
The United States mobilized for war. The reserves were called up.
At the time we entered into the war, led the UN into the war with us, it was a very popular war.
Everybody was agitated, getting ready to go overseas. There were all sorts of feelings. Trepidation, expectancy. There was quite a feeling of wanting to stop the communists from taking over anywhere in the world. They wanted to stem the tide of communism.
General Douglas MacArthur, the Allied Supreme Commander in Tokyo and the legendary victor of the Pacific War, was appointed to lead the United Nations forces.
He was worshipped in Japan. This man had a tremendous ego and had been fed for all these years. I do believe he was, at this point, felt that he was infallible.
The nearest troops to Korea were the American occupation force in Japan, few of whom were ready for combat.
The lifestyle involved a lot of leisure. I like to live through the Sears Roebuck catalog, who bought nylons and whatnot for the native girls and that sort of thing. It was a good life.
The U.S. task force sent to Korea didn't imagine their stay would be for long.
As a matter of fact, we were told to take our athletic equipment and leave everything else behind because we'd only be gone for maybe 6 weeks. Have a show of force in the field, and those gooks would go back across 38th parallel and we'd come home.
It wouldn't be that easy. Rhee's South Korean army was in retreat. 2 divisions threw their weapons away and joined the refugees fleeing the communist advance.
As soldiers, we did our utmost, but the overall situation was going against us. The North Korean army achieved its initial objective. It captured Seoul in 3 days.
With the capture of the southern capital, Kim Il-sung won a great victory for communism.
우리는 서울까지 작전이 다 끝났으니까.
When we got to Seoul, the army told us the campaign was finished. They told us political reforms will follow. Now the country will be unified with ease. We didn't think there would be any more war.
인정하고 전쟁이 다시 있을 거는 예상도 안 했습니다.
American troops fared no better than the South Koreans. With no effective anti-tank weapons, the American line collapsed. Within days, American troops were reeling back in disarray under assault from the tiny communist regime of North Korea.
We had equipment left over from World War II. We were in very poor shape for everything. We were not ready to fight a war. That's what it amounts to. That's the long and short of it.
Around the world, America's allies rallied behind the United Nations flag. The British Prime Minister pledged his support.
If the United Nations organization was not to go the way of the old League of Nations, it was absolutely and imperatively necessary that a halt should be called.
Troops from 15 nations began to arrive in Korea to join the Americans in the UN Army. General MacArthur took a gamble to turn the tide of the war. With the UN forces driven back to a tiny enclave at Pusan, a vast seaborne invasion 150 miles behind enemy lines would attempt to sever and then roll back the North Korean advance. Dawn, September 15th, 1950. The largest invasion fleet since the Second World War bombards the port of Incheon. American and Korean Marines go ashore in huge numbers.
When we landed, we approached the beach at full speed. The ramp of the landing craft opened with a bang, and we charged with our guns, screaming down the ramp.
There was a seawall there, cut stone. It had to be scaled. The actual landing conditions were terrible. Part of the city was on fire. It was a rainy day, and the rain was mixing with the smoke of the fire and the smoke of the bombardment. If those beaches had been defended by Japanese or German troops of the same quality as the Germans and Japanese were in World War II, we would have been lucky to get ashore, and we might not have been quite so lucky once we got ashore.
Within 2 weeks, UN troops were engaged in a fierce battle to recapture the southern capital, Seoul. 50,000 civilians were killed in the crossfire.
My house was located in a hillside, and there was a crossfire between the UN forces and the North Korean People's Army on the northern side. Finally, my father told us that it would be better that how our family split up. At least somebody will have to survive this war.
After finally recapturing Seoul, MacArthur reinstated Syngman Rhee in the Parliament building. MacArthur's association with Rhee's increasingly vicious regime caused concern in Washington.
Syngman Rhee was a difficult man to back. And once he was in power, it was very difficult for us to do anything. It was not up to us to change the government, and there was no other alternative, obviously, available anyway.
Rhee's jubilant army was the first to cross the 38th parallel into North Korea.
우리가 다시 반격을 해서 38선 돌파에 건너갈 때
When we counterattacked across the 38th parallel, every one of us, soldiers and people, thought now the drive was on to unify the whole Korean peninsula.
통일이 되는 하나의 결정적인 계기가 왔다. 이렇게 생각을 했습니다.
The UN troops too advanced into North Korea. MacArthur's war aim now appeared to be hot pursuit of the invader.
I thought we'd won the war. I shouldn't laugh at this point, but I have to. I really thought we had won the war, and I think that was a general feeling. And we went north with high hopes.
The giant Yalu River marks the boundary between North Korea and China. Across this border, the Chinese leadership followed the war with alarm. They feared the American army in North Korea would invade the Chinese mainland.
If North Korea was defeated, only the Yalu River would separate us from the Americans. We couldn't accept this, nor the risk of American aircraft disrupting the reconstruction of our country.
From devastated North Korea, an urgent message went out to Beijing.
A government delegation was sent to Mao Zedong. What can we do, they asked. We can't retreat. They're attacking us from the air, from the sea, and by land. There's very little of the North Korean army left. Many have died. What can we do now?
The communist leadership in Beijing was deeply divided over intervention. Mao received secret cables from Stalin telling him to enter the war to save North Korea. Wanting to assert China's power in Asia, Mao was agreeable. Meanwhile, the UN and South Korean armies continued the race north. On October 19th, Pyongyang fell. It was the only communist capital ever to fall to the West during the Cold War.
MacArthur had the bit in his teeth. He was pursuing a defeated army. The race to the Yalu was on.
MacArthur was surprised to be summoned to Wake Island in mid-Pacific for a meeting with President Truman. MacArthur assured his commander-in-chief there was no possibility of China entering the war. He took the award of yet another medal as a signal that he could continue the advance towards China. When the president asked him to stay for lunch, MacArthur refused. While Truman and MacArthur were talking, Mao ordered the Chinese army, called the People's Volunteers, to enter Korea. 500,000 Chinese began to cross the Yalu River and waited for the UN forces to approach the border. As they crossed the Yalu in enormous numbers, the volunteers sang this song.
雄赳赳，喜昂昂，跨过鸭绿江，为祖国，为国兵，就是保家乡。祖国好儿女，齐心团结，金汉美援朝，打败美帝铁心郎，就是这个样。
Unaware of the massing of the Chinese troops, the US Army paused for Thanksgiving. Roast turkey and cranberry sauce were served up. MacArthur and his soldiers still thought the war would be over by Christmas.
Well, Thanksgiving Day in 1950 was a very fine day. The weather was nice. The typical Thanksgiving dinners were there. We had everything that we would have had we been at home. And it was just a very nice day. And that was the last nice day we had.
Next morning, 300,000 Chinese attacked.
They'd blow these bugles, and they had a chilling effect on the soldiers.
The first aim of the volunteers going into Korea was to defend our homes and country, the motherland. We couldn't allow others to cross the Yalu River and invade us. But also we wanted to help the Korean people.
As in China's long civil war, Mao believed that greater motivation could defeat an enemy with superior arms.
Because our war was a just war, the enemy could be defeated. Our bravery and our strategy, developed during the years of the liberation struggle, would help defeat the enemy.
The reaction when China came in was that we had a whole new war, a whole new situation. It was a very terrifying situation, and one that was extremely troubling.
In the next swing of this seesaw war, UN forces across North Korea were thrown back, abandoning vehicles and equipment.
We had people on top of the trucks, on the running boards, just heading south. I never felt so inadequate in my life as to be part of an army that was running. It's unbelievable.
I ask you to imagine a situation where the temperature is 25 below zero. Nothing is working as well as it should. Weapons have difficulty firing in that kind of a temperature. A lot of Chinese out there.
I'm not aware of any other movement of Americans that were as futile as that rout was. And it was a rout.
American soldiers called it bug-out fever.
We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival. We have committed ourselves to the cause of a just and peaceful world order through the United Nations. We stand by that commitment.
At a Washington press conference, journalists repeatedly pressed Truman on the possible use of the atom bomb.
It went on and on and on, just like that. The president not being able to shut this thing off, and till people began to think that maybe we were going to use the atomic bomb. The bulletins about the president's press conference went around the world immediately, and that caused incredible alarm.
British Prime Minister Clement Attlee was sufficiently alarmed to fly to Washington for crisis talks.
My aim in these talks is to align our policies in the new and troubled situation in the world and to find the means of upholding what we both know to be right.
Next day, Truman assured Attlee that there were no plans to use atomic weapons.
I think the Americans understood it would be tit for tat. If they use it, we will use it. We had an agreement with the Chinese. That's why they didn't use the atomic bomb.
At home that winter, for many American families, the pain began with a call at the door.
The 29th of December, the doorbell rang. It was on a Friday. I had just washed my hair. And I opened the door, and there was a boy delivering a telegram. And he turned on his heels and left. And I knew the telegram was going to tell me either he was dead or alive. And when I opened it, I just thanked God that he was missing in action. As far as knowing when he became a prisoner, that wasn't for another year. Even though we knew he was in a camp, I never knew from day to day how he was doing. I never knew from letter to letter if he was alive, so I always held out hope that he would come home, but I never could say that he would come home.
Retreating UN soldiers adopted a scorched earth policy. After withdrawing from Hungnam, American engineers blew up the dockside. The Chinese, rapidly advancing, recaptured the northern capital, Pyongyang. At the beginning of 1951, Seoul fell again to the Communists. General Matthew B. Ridgway was appointed by MacArthur as the new field commander. At last, UN troops began to slow the Chinese advance.
The defeatism and the bug-out fever and so forth that had afflicted the Eighth Army before was eradicated.
From the beginning, the United States enjoyed air supremacy.
When I was flying up along the Yalu in the F-86, the Sabre, we were using tactics that literally had been used in World War I and World War II, except we're flying jets at much higher speed.
When Russian MiG-15 fighters with well-trained Russian pilots were sent to the war zone, they posed a challenge to American supremacy.
Мы имели задачу туда ехать.
Our mission was to go there to train pilots.
Для обучения.
But later we ended up as participants in the Korean War.
Оказались участниками этой Корейской войны.
The presence of Russian pilots risked bringing the Soviet Union into direct conflict with the United States.
Наше руководство, и государственное, так и военное.
Our government and the military demanded complete secrecy.
Нас обязывали, как можно.
We must never let the enemy know they were fighting Russians.
Чтоб наш противник не понял, что воюет против них русские.
When the US deployed the F-86 Sabre, they slowly won back mastery of the skies. This enabled American aircraft to keep up a constant offensive on ground targets.
For ground attack, we were flying the F-9F, the Panthers. Now, they would carry a large bomb load, and we could carry a couple of 1,000-pound bombs on that airplane, and on some flights, 100-gallon napalm tanks with a white phosphorus grenade cap on there so that when it hit the ground and impacted, it would burst into flame and ignite the napalm. And so we used all of those things from time to time on ground attack.
MacArthur now called for the bombing of Chinese cities and for the pursuit of the war in mainland China. This was too much for Truman.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons: to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
By the summer of 1951, the two sides had fought themselves to a stalemate in the hills of Korea, almost at the point at which the fighting had begun a year earlier. Every month brought another 2,500 UN casualties.
It became evident to us that we were not going to fight this war to win it, that we were going to fight it to some negotiated kind of peace.
Armistice talks began in July 1951, but got nowhere. Both sides found the other's attitude impossible.
이 공산주의자들하고 교섭이라는 건 굉장히 어렵습니다.
Negotiation with the communists was very difficult. They treated the negotiations like a battlefield tactic, something to buy time.
그 사람네들은 시간 버는 것도 있고요.
One of the main stumbling blocks at the truce talks was the fate of the prisoners of war. Both North and South Koreans maltreated their prisoners. 1 in 3 American POWs held by the North Koreans died during the first winter.
A lot of them were lost to dysentery, diarrhea, severe beatings, malnutrition. Some of them were, stragglers. They were just beat with rifle bullets till they died, or bayoneted, or you either kept up or you died. It was that simple.
Concerned by the numbers dying, the Chinese took over control of the prisoners. They organized daily lectures to indoctrinate them.
They'd say, "We will tell you why you come to Korea, why you have come thousands of miles from your homes to spill your blood for the profiteering warmongers on Wall Street, why you come here to lay down your young lives. They are sleeping with your wives and daughters. Do you think this is right?" And this would go on for days on end, hour on end, days on end, forever, continuously.
Back home, few people wanted to know.
Everybody was involved with World War II, but nobody was involved with Korea. The newspapers had so little in them. If I wanted to know what was going on in Korea yesterday, I would have to get the New York Times, because on page 2, they had a short column on the Korean War every day. But most of the other papers didn't, and you would only see headlines when there was a skirmish or if some hill had been lost or won, you know. So there wasn't that interest. There really wasn't. You know, it wasn't like Vietnam where you ate dinner and watched television and saw the latest battle. You know, there wasn't anything like that.
In Japan, the Korean War galvanized the economy, generating $3.5 billion of spending. Japan, the ex-enemy, now became a bastion of capitalism in the struggle with communism in Asia.
Japan became the jumping-off place for the Korean War. The dockyards and shipyards were used to rebuild, recondition the ships. Japanese electronics, which are probably now the top of the world, really got their start in the Korean War.
In South Korea, the UN held 130,000 communist prisoners. Each one was asked if he wanted to return to his country of origin or stay in the non-communist world. The communists were outraged when almost half of the POWs chose not to return to their communist homes. Violent protest dogged the camps. When the armistice talks resumed at Panmunjom, the fate of the prisoners delayed the negotiations for months on end. As the truce talks stalled, the relentless bombing continued. American bombers dropped almost as much explosive on North Korea as they had on Germany during World War II.
The bombers came without warning. Too many people died because of the bombing. You found dead people everywhere. There was hardly a single house left standing. They bombed the big cities, the villages, and the countryside in the same way. I saw it all with my own eyes.
Estimates suggest that in the north, as many as 2 million civilians were killed.
It was horrific. They said Stalingrad was destroyed 96% in the Second World War, but Pyongyang was destroyed 100%. Everything was burnt to ashes. Not a single house left.
Throughout the war, both sides committed horrible atrocities. Northerners killed Southerners accused of sympathizing with the enemy. Rhee's supporters massacred those suspected of being communists. In seemingly endless violence, innocent civilians were often the victims. At Panmunjom, the talking continued. Spanning 2 years, there were hundreds of meetings. 1952, election year in America. 2 years into the war, Truman decided not to run for the Democrats. The Republicans chose Dwight D. Eisenhower. His slogan, "I shall go to Korea."
A lot of us were disenchanted with President Truman. I somehow blamed him for the war. So when the elections came up in 1952, I couldn't wait to vote for Eisenhower. I felt, being a military man, and his pledge was that he would see what he could do to end that war, that he was the man I wanted in office.
Eisenhower defeated the Democrats in a landslide victory. There were changes in the East also. In March 1953, the communist world mourned the death of Stalin. Stalin had kept the war going. His successors wanted to end it.
Soviet and North Korean leaders came to believe it was impossible to win this war, because on the side of South Korea was the whole world, and on the North Korean side was the Soviet Union and China. So an armistice was inevitable.
A ceasefire was finally agreed on July 27, 1953. The Chinese, the North Koreans, and the UN backed the agreement. The South Korean president, Syngman Rhee, opposed the truce and refused to sign. The massive job of exchanging prisoners of war began. 75,000 communist prisoners were handed over. 12,000 United Nations POWs were also set free.
There's no words to describe how elated I was and my friends as we come across the line. It felt like tons had been lifted from your back. It felt like for the last 2.5 years I'd been carrying an enormous amount of weight, I mean tons. And all at once I could breathe, I was light, I was free. Freedom's something you can't describe.
Bernie Gehling also went home. Florence was there to meet him.
I'd only known him 6 months. We were only married 6 days. This young man who left with blonde, wavy hair came back with brown, straight hair. Thinned. And he was gaunt. I mean, he no longer had the facial structure that he had when he left. This man that I had waited for 33 months. And then he comes home, and I don't really know him. But it didn't take long.
"54,000 Americans didn't go home. The war claimed the lives of 3,000 men from the armies of 15 other nations. In China, Mao called it a great victory, and the volunteers returned home as heroes. An estimated 500,000 Chinese soldiers had died in the war.
The volunteers demonstrated to the rest of the world that the Chinese were no longer the Chinese of the past. China could not be bullied. China was no longer the lame dog of Asia.
In North and South, 3 million Koreans were killed, wounded, or missing. Another 5 million were homeless.
53년도 정전 협정할 때
When the truce was negotiated in 1953, there was a chance for the Korean people to breathe.
조선인민들이 숨쉴 기회가 있다.
But there is no real victory in war. It kills so many people and destroys so much.
승리했다. 거기서 무슨 승리가 있어요?
No victory, but the West held the line. In Korea, communism had been contained.
In broad terms, it was a defeat for socialism. We were unable to impose the socialist system on South Korea, so it was a defeat.
40 years later, at the end of the Cold War, Korea was still divided by the same line.